My name is Monk Rowe, and we are filming at Hamilton College today for the Jazz Archive. And I'm very pleased to have another Hamilton alum, Phil Mead, class of '59, here today. Welcome.
It's good to be here.
And
thanks for having me.
Thank you. You mentioned that this is one of your favorite rooms. We're in the browsing room.
I spent many very happy hours, and I hoped I learned something. I did all my reading in this room, and it never was terribly popular. I don't know why, so I could always get a seat, and I would bring my David Copperfield or whatever had been assigned and sit here and read, and I always have very warm memories. It's great to be here.
That's great. And of course, you lived on this side of campus because
that's the only side there was. That's right.
Right. You're the second Hamilton alum I've interviewed. The other one was Milt Filius, who was class of '44. But I asked him, and I'm going to ask you, I've always been impressed by the loyalty of a significant number of Hamilton alums. And is there a reason for that in your mind?
Well, I surely agree with you. It's remarkable. It was true in my case. I still have very close friendships with many of my classmates, and yet both my sons went here, one class of '88, one class of '90, and they have exactly the same friendships. And indeed, those friends are now friends of my wife and I. We, often on New Year's Eve, we'll get a call from a Lieutenant J.G. in Tokyo, who's stationed there, and just calling us up to wish us Happy New Year. It's a remarkable thing, and I don't know if it's the smallness of the school. I've always thought the isolation might have had something to do with it. Certainly when I was there, and I'm not sure it's a great deal different, your friends were the people that you went to college with because there wasn't much else around. And
right.
So whatever it is, it's been great through my lifetime, and it's great to see it happen to my sons.
Right. You didn't have to go down the hill for too much, or maybe there wasn't too much to go for.
Went down the hill for our haircuts, and that was about it.
Yeah. Do you remember what your tuition was?
I believe it cost about $2,000 to go to Hamilton when I started in 1955. And I just chatting with my wife on the way over here today. The reason I think that's about right is that I pretty much was able to pay my way through Hamilton. And I used to make, I had a $600 state scholarship. Those were New York State scholarship. And I used to make about $600 playing with the Catatonic Five, which was a pretty good pay in those days. And a long summer job, I could usually eke out $50 a week, so that was another $600. So I think my dad had to come up with a couple hundred, and that was, and I got my Hamilton education. So different today.
Yeah, very different. But at the time, can I guess that you didn't feel like you were getting a tremendous bargain? I mean, you were working for it, and it wasn't for free.
Certainly, it had been my goal to go to college and to go on to medical school, and so this was just in the plan, and because of the scholarship and the band and the summer jobs, it all worked out, and so you just sort of, that was a plan, and you hewed to it, and it worked out, and you were glad it went as planned.
Yeah. Well, when you were here, was there an active music department?
Very much so. John Baldwin had come, I think, a few years before, and of course was starting his reign as just an outstanding choir director, a technically just stupendous organist. I don't know if you've ever heard, if you ever were fortunate to hear John play the organ, but he really was a wonderful musician, and so there was that, and then there was the jazz, which I'm sure we'll get into. So that, and then Barry Shute was the old professor of music, and used to have us down to his home, and we'd listen on the old scratchy 78 records. In the evening, we'd listen to opera. It was a different era, but it was very intimate, and for music, that's the best.
Do you think there's a difference now with music is so available in huge quantities to younger people through iPods and the internet and the whole thing, where during your era and my era it was not so gettable all the time. Do you think it makes a difference?
Well, I'm not sure. That's an interesting hypothesis. Something that I've noticed through the years is when I was growing up, playing a musical instrument was kind of a big deal, and people were many people did that. And of course, it was the era of the town bands and all of that. I noticed today in Vermont, that's very true. There are lots and lots of young musicians, middle school kids, who really are great players and who take great pride in their playing. Interestingly, when my boys were at that stage, and so that was more in the 70s, sports seemed to be more important. And so I don't know if that's the biased thing I'm seeing where I live, or if there's something to that. But I would say that I don't think there's a big difference between today and the old days. I think there are a lot of really good musicians around, and I think ultimately live music is what's exciting and what makes it work. So I'm looking for a resurgence, if you will, with all these young cats, get out of school and get to play, and maybe we'll see more of that. But I certainly agree with you. It seemed like in the 70s and 80s it was more we listened to music rather than played it.
Yeah.
It will be fun to get back to the playing it.
Right. Well, my daughter actually did a little research for me, and she came up with some of the top 10 hits of around the mid-50s. And they have such songs as "Oh My Papa" by Eddie Fisher, and "Don't Let the Stars Get in Your Eyes," Perry Como. "That's Amore," Dean Martin. And then even, into the rock and roll era with Bill Haley and the Comets. Now, nowhere on this list are any Dixieland hits. So tell me why you came to Hamilton and were able to find people like yourself who are still into that music.
Well, let me go back a little bit.
Yeah, please.
My history. My dad, who actually was a great runner, qualified for the 1928 Olympics. Went to Wesleyan, but loved music, and was a pretty decent soprano saxophone player. You can relate to that. Had a nice Buescher soprano saxophone, which he played at Wesleyan. He graduated in 1928, but then he became a self-taught jazz piano player and was actually a very good piano player. And my earliest remembrances are Dad, when he'd come home from work at night, he would play the piano, and he would play all the great old tunes, Jada and The Curse of an Aching Heart, and on, all the great old Dixie tunes. And as a child, I just grew up with that. And I used to hum those tunes just because I heard them all the time. We then moved to, we moved around a lot. My dad worked for the telephone company in upstate New York and was moved every few years. We then moved to Syracuse, and when I was about 10, they gave free music lessons. And Edward Smith Junior High School in Syracuse. And so I wanted to take trombone lessons, but you had to furnish your own instrument, and we were careful with our money, as Depression-era families were. And so he said, well, you can take my saxophone. So I learned to play the saxophone and actually became pretty good at it. And so then he got me a tenor sax because he thought that was, and by then we had moved to Schenectady. And they had some good musicians in Schenectady, including a band, Donnie James and his orchestra, high school kids, very good. Of course, this was around 1948 to 50. I was 10 or 12. And of course, those were the great swing bands, Glenn Gray and all that, and they had all those charts. And so the tenor player in this dance band was a catcher, and he couldn't play in the summer. So I got recruited even though I was only 12. And I could read like crazy. I couldn't solo very well, but I could read like crazy. So I was sitting up there in the sax section just loving it. And so that was, and so then I got a clarinet because, you know, you have to double. And so I thought of myself as a clarinetist and saxophone player. My dad, at this point, began having jam sessions in our house, and we invite people over. And my high school music teacher, it's a guy named Chief McNally, who was a trombonist, had been brought up his parents were Salvation Army folks.
Oh my.
And you're not supposed to leave the Army. You're supposed to stay in the Salvation Army if you're a child. But he was so good, he went on the road with some big bands, played with Red Nichols, and then got in the Navy and came home, fell in love with one of his childhood sweethearts who was also a Salvation Army child. And she convinced him, she couldn't convince him to go back in the Salvation Army, but she did convince him to come off the road and to be a music teacher. Okay. So he was my teacher. It's a long story.
It's a bit of a compromise on his part, but a good one.
Good one, although he didn't last that long in high school music. In any event, so that's about the time that I decided I wanted to go to Hamilton College. And I heard, great, they had a Dixieland band. And I'd been listening, you know, I was kind of brought up as a swing player, but I'd been listening to Dixieland. And my dad would occasionally take me down to New York to Eddie Condon's. He was a great Condon fan, and I became a great Condon fan. So I heard they had a Dixieland band in Hamilton, and the leader was a guy named Emerson Brown. So I called them up and told him who I was, and I said, do you have a spot for a clarinetist? He said, no, because I'm the clarinetist and I'm the leader. He said, but we need a trombone player. And I said, I think I've got one for you. So I went over to Chief McNally, and he sold me his trombone, which was a great trombone, 1932 Martin committee model.
You still playing it?
Well, I have it. I don't play it. It's a little pea shooter,
okay.
But just a wonderful horn. I love it dearly. And he sold me that, and I came to Hamilton not knowing how to play the trombone, but knowing a lot about Dixieland music. And basically, that was how I got started.
That's a great story, and you had a great motivation to learn the music because you had hopefully a spot to go for it.
So that all sort of fell together, and I can remember the first night I was at Hamilton, I heard somebody over in what we used to call Silliman Hall playing the piano, and it was Derry Hall.
Derry?
Derry Hall, and Derry went to Hamilton and actually played with some of the jazz bands there, and actually was a guy who played piano for us at Carnegie Hall with the Catatonic Five.
Yeah.
But I took my horn over there, and he was very nice to me. He just graduated that year or year before, and we played a little bit, and then I met Emerson, and the Catatonic Five came together, and that's how it all happened.
Now, what's the history? Do you know about the history of the name, the Catatonic Five?
I really don't, and I bet you Donnie Andre can tell you about that.
Okay.
The band, of course, and Dick Sherman will give you the history of jazz up to that point. But this was fall of '55, and the band that came together was M. Brown, who was a senior. He was a clarinetist and the leader. Donnie Andre was a sophomore and a banjo player and became the manager of the band and really did a yeoman job getting the gigs and doing all the hard work of running a band. And myself, a brand new trombonist, you know, just trying to learn how to play the trombone. We were the three Hamilton guys. And then Johnny Johnson was two guys from Colgate. Johnny Johnson, who was a technically brilliant pianist from Colgate and went on to be a high school music teacher, and Peter Ill, who was a trumpet player from Colgate. And I don't know what happened to Peter after he graduated. So that, and then we always had remarkable drummers. And the two guys who played the most for us were Ronnie Zito. Ronnie was a young kid, probably 16, 15, from Utica, and he played with us a lot. He loved to go on these gigs. He loved my jokes. He just had the best time, and he was just a powerful drummer. He had the greatest time in the world. And he was supposed to go to Europe with us, but his mother wouldn't let him go. So, but Ronnie, of course, went on to become a famous drummer and made some great sides with Woody Herman.
Right.
Some of the I think Woody Herman's some of his classics, Opus Defunct, the Old Horace Silver tune, Ronnie Zito on drums, just unbelievable, powerful, big drummer. And
from a very musical family too, with Torrey, who went on with Tony Bennett and all that.
So then the other guy who mostly played with us was Jimmy Wormworth, and he's sort of the guy I think of as our drummer, because Jimmy and I became very close friends. But Jimmy was my age, so he was, he was 18 starting out, and he was a bop drummer. Yeah. Not really. Ronnie was always a big band drummer. I mean, he could play anything, but he was a big band drummer, swing band drummer. But Jimmy was a bop drummer, but wonderful drummer. And he and I became very close friends, and stay in touch to this day. Yeah. And he, of course, was the drummer for Lambert Hendricks and Ross. Right. Played with almost everybody in the 50s and 60s. And just had a remarkable career, and it's still playing now with Charles Davis, and still I heard him a couple of years ago when they came up to Vermont, and he hadn't lost a beat. He's wonderful. So those were two, and then occasionally when the two of them couldn't make it, there was a guy whose nickname was Grogan, and I'm trying to come back with his name, but he was a marvelous drummer. So we had these just killer drummers. Wow. and I think they really kicked the band along, and I think everybody in the band was a pretty good musician, but the drummers were certainly spectacular. I don't think there was any other college band then or now that had this kind of talent, just week in and week out, right. just kicking you along, and so I think that had a lot to do with the excitement at the beginning, and of course once we got playing, then it just all kind of came together.
So were you playing the same kind of repertoire that the Alumni AllStars play now?
I think we were a little more New York, Chicago-based. I'm never happy with the labels very much.
It's hard to label things.
But I mean the real, as you can imagine, with Jimmy Wormworth on drums, who was basically a bop drummer, we were a 4-beat Dixieland band, which is sort of interesting because we didn't have a bass most of the time. We had a banjo, so it was kind of a unique mix to have the standard front line of trumpet, clarinet, and trombone, but then sort of this mixed up rhythm section of a bop drummer, a really sort of classical or outstanding cocktail pianist, piano player, and a banjo player. But it worked fine. But I think we played much more. I can't say swinging because I think the AllStars swing now, but it was much more 4-beat, and it was much more like Condon's stuff. Okay. We were influenced very much in the 50s by what was going on in New York. Central Plaza, Nick's, Condon's.
Right. So the group didn't really think of itself as playing, I'm not sure how to put this, but old music.
That's right. This was our music. You put it perfectly. This was our music. This was what was happening. I mean, in those days, New York City was the center of the world. There was no other city that came close to it. And the jazz music in New York City was at Condon's, was at Nick's, the Central Plaza, and it was this kind of Dixieland. And of course, all the great guys were playing then. And we thought of that as we did not think we were playing our father's music, which is but it was sort of interesting because we were, and that was sort of one of the neat parts of it, that we were playing this old stuff. I mean, a tune like "The Curse of an Aching Heart" is an old tune, and yet you can make it swing like crazy,
Yeah.
and we did.
That's really interesting. And I'm trying to picture, you played for frat parties and...
Mostly fraternity parties.
Okay.
The places we played most, we played at all Cornell house parties. And that was sort of interesting too, because in those days at Hamilton, we had Saturday classes, and you really weren't supposed to cut classes, particularly if you're a pre-med and you really were, you had a tough schedule. So a typical house party weekend would be at Cornell would be like this. I'd finish up my lab at maybe 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. We'd load up. Em had a Studebaker. The doors didn't close very well, so we always referred to them as fallopian doors. And as I became an obstetrician,
That's terrific.
those are the fallopian doors. And we'd load the car up, and we'd get down to Cornell about 6 o'clock, and get set up in one of the fraternity houses, and get playing along about 8, and quit about midnight. Then those of us who had Saturday classes, and the seniors often didn't, but I was a freshman or sophomore, so I would borrow M's car at 12 o'clock, get in the car, and drive back to Hamilton. I'd go to classes, and that get done at noon, grab a little lunch, get back in the car, drive back down, get down there at 2. We usually played at a picnic in the afternoon.
Oh my.
Then we played in a fraternity house at night. We never had any, hotel rooms or anything. We'd sleep on floors or on couches, or occasionally, you'd find a dorm room that was open, that had a bunk you could climb into, and scrounge food where you could. And then there was always a milk punch party in the morning at one of the fraternities at Cornell. We always played that gig. And then get in the car, come back here, and at 7 o'clock you had compulsory chapel, and then you were back in the lab for the week. That was a typical weekend.
Let me rewind just a bit. What's a milk punch party?
Oh, milk punch was a concoction of milk and ice cream and liquor.
Okay.
And all mixed up, sort of like half of a vanilla. If you took half a vanilla milkshake and put an equal amount of booze in it, and those were very popular in those days. Sunday morning milk punch parties.
Sort of the hair of the dog type thing.
Very much, very much.
That's a great description of your weekend. How much money would you have netted for that
Usually,
kind of
for
work?
each of those gigs, you'd get about $12. So as you could see, I mean, you might. Those were big weekends. I mean, most times you just go out and it'd be a Saturday night,
Right.
But you could make $50, $60, and if every once in a while there'd be a very wealthy alum there who loved Dixieland that would come up and give everybody in the band a $20 bill, which was, and so
That's a big event, isn't it? That's great. Great
But
description.
just to finish up one thing, so we didn't think of ourselves as playing in the Catatonic Five as playing traditional jazz, and we frankly didn't listen to a lot of traditional jazz. I mean, we were much more listening to the stuff that was going on in New York. So Turk Murphy and Kid Ory and stuff like that. We not that we didn't like it. We just didn't deal with that very much.
Right. I think it's how musicians usually learn music is they grab what's happening at the time, and then if they get interested to go backwards, they will. They like, gee, where did this come from? Who do you suppose these people listen to?
That's exactly what's happened to me. I mean, now at the age of 69, I'm actually going back and listening to Kid Ory and George Bruni's and some of these people, and it's remarkable stuff. So,
but the people you played for, did you ever have some of the frat fellas play some rock and roll?
Not in those days.
No.
They loved the stuff, and that's, I think, the sad part of the world for me today is that the audience is going away. It was so much fun. I mean, you'd go in and you'd have just throngs of people. You know, on a nice spring evening, you know, you'd wind up on some terrace, you know, and, you know, half the Cornell football team would carry the grand piano out on the terrace, and it would be a nice night, and there'd be all sorts of people. They loved the music, and it was so much fun. But that's what the music was. They really, rock and roll really hadn't. We were just a little before that. Really, Elvis got going, you know, while we were really after we were out of college.
Okay, yeah, because that was a sort of a, I don't know if I would call it a downtime for pop music. But there wasn't anything really strong for a number of years there, so I think your timing was pretty good for that.
Some people who are historians and know about this stuff really think that Elvis was a watershed. Was, and some very fine musicians believe that he wasn't just a, you know, kind of a great pop guy. I mean, he really made a huge difference in how we all thought about and listened to music.
Right. I've had a number of musicians
Leonard Bernstein
say that.
has said that. Yeah.
That was a big transition from swing to straight eighth notes is how some of the musicians would characterize it. That's terrific. And your parents thought this was a pretty good way for you to make a buck?
They not only, of course, my dad loved music so much that he was happiest when he was either playing or listening. And I mean, this guy played until he was 97, and he just finally just ran out of steam. In fact, the last time I played with my dad, we were playing, and I was thinking, you know, this guy on piano is just the timing is rock solid, and you know his harmonies were just delicious, and it's just and then all of a sudden I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's my dad. Yeah. He's 97. Yeah. But he was 95. I shouldn't exaggerate. He was 95. Wow. But every once in a while, you know, we'd be playing a gig, and you know, and you'd look out, and there were mother and dad. They had their drink in their hand, and they were right there cheering the band on, and they would drive up to these things and just to listen. And people were always very nice to them. They'd always get them drinks, and they had a good time. And
that's a great feeling. And I had a similar circumstance when I was actually in my rock and roll days. My parents would come out and support the band, even though it probably wasn't their cup of tea.
In fact, there's a funny story about that sort of goes along with some of the other stuff we were talking about. That as I said, we always had these spectacular drummers, except one night all three of them couldn't make it. We had a gig at Hobart, and so they suggested this other high school kid. So I mean, we were so spoiled by these, you know, by Ronnie Zito and Jimmy Wormworth and Grogan that we were just, wow, this guy's probably just as good. Well, we got out there. He was just dreadful. He was awful. And I felt badly for him because he was a young child and he just was out of his element. So, but the band just sounded awful. So as it turned out, my folks had driven all the way from Albany to Geneva, New York, which is a pretty good hike, to hear the band. They walked up and down listening for the band. And when they heard this, they said, that can't be the Catatonic Five because they also have good drummers. So they went home, which was just as good because we didn't play well that
I'll
night.
be darned. They never even found you. They just said, no, that wasn't us.
They said, that wasn't us if they have a drummer like that. So.
Well, I'm going to ask you about something you said. That you said we didn't play or listen to too much traditional jazz. So what is traditional jazz for you?
Well, again, as I said, I have trouble putting labels on things. Some of the real West Coast Turk Murphy kind of stuff, I guess I've never particularly enjoyed that. And I've never had much opportunity to play it, so maybe if I did, I would. But as I say, I'm getting more and more blurred as I go back, as I begin to go back. Now probably at the moment, my two favorite trombonists after for years being kind of a fan of bop trombonists. I mean, J.J. Johnson and Jimmy Cleveland were my heroes, and still are, and yet as I listen to Teagarden, I think he's head and shoulders above anybody.
Yeah.
He's just playing stuff. And now Dick Sherman has got me listening to George Bruni's, and as I listen to him, I think, wow. I mean, this is and technically these guys are excellent. This idea that old musicians, the old musicians weren't great technicians is crazy.
Mm-hmm. George
Bruni is every bit the technician that any of those, the great bop players are. So it's the more I listen, I think good people playing almost anything are fun to listen to.
Yeah.
And so
was the band an entity at Hamilton as well? It sounds like you went off campus to play a lot of your gigs.
Yes, and I think good question, and I think in two ways. Number one, Hamilton was very small then, 600-700 students, very isolated. The interstate had just opened. I mean, this is really, so things were very much clustered around here. So everybody knew what was going on. And if we all got snowed in here, we'd have a jam session. There were some other musicians here. There's a guy named George Rudder, who had a piano player who's actually a very good piano player who plays now out in the Midwest. He had a band called the Oriskany Rhythm Kings, a name I always thought was much better than the Catatonic Five, but anyway. So we'd get together and play. We played for house parties here, obviously. Occasionally, they just, they'd hire us as a jam session here. And so everybody knew the band, and it was kind of music in those days, live music was a focal point of parties. I mean, you get a band, and then you have a party, which was sort of neat. And so you needed to have the band to have the party. So in that sense, we really were a part of the college. The other thing that I think was that we were one of the top Dixieland bands in the collegiate circuit in those years. There were other very good bands. Tigertown Five at Princeton was probably the most famous. Spring Street Stompers was a great band from Williams. They had a wonderful trombonist, although I was never sure he was a matriculated student, but but
he was a ringer.
The High Street Five from Wesleyan, there were a handful of them, but the Catatonic Five was highly rated. The fact that we played at Carnegie Hall in '56 and toured Europe that same year, so I thought it actually reflected very favorably on the college. Here's this little tiny college that's got the best Dixieland band, one of the best Dixieland bands in the country, and was getting a lot of press. And I think we were proud of that. And frankly, I'm not sure Sandy McEwen was very proud of it, but Sandy, who didn't allow no jazz on Sunday. But I think that
you can't just gloss over that. You have to tell me about that.
I'll let Dick Sherman tell you about that. That's his story. But the president was a Presbyterian minister, and he wasn't much of a jazz fan. But I think most people thought it was great. I mean, gee, here's a big placard. There's a midnight jam session at Carnegie Hall on November 24th, and it's Hamilton College. And who announced this but Jack Crystal, Billy Crystal's dad.
Oh, gosh.
And so, I think that it was good for the college, and I think people recognized that.
And how did that gig come about?
Donnie Andre will have to tell you that.
Okay.
I don't know. Don was just great about getting these various gigs for us, including the one to Europe, which was a wonderful.
Did you play on a boat?
The only job we had was going over and coming back on the Holland American lines. These were little ships. They'd been on the Indonesian line, and they put them into summer service for the students. One class. These were small ships. We left on June 23rd 1956, my 19th birthday. That's why I remember the date. And on this little ship, and played 10 days over. These were small, slow ships, just students. And you can imagine it was a 10-day house party.
Wow.
And we played over, and then we came back the first week in September on the Zuyder cruise, which was another Holland American Line ship. Now, two key things happened in the summer of '56. You will remember one of them probably. 3 days after we left, Clifford Brown was killed. He died on June 26, 1956, on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Clifford Brown was always my favorite musician. Just technique, soul, whatever. Just unbelievable. And so that was, and we learned that on the ship. That was sad. The other thing that happened that summer was the Andrea Doria was sunk. Mm-hmm. And that's 50 years ago, exactly, 1956. And most people went back and forth to Europe on ships. Plane travel was very tough then. You really had to go up to Gander, Newfoundland, and then over to Greenland, and then over to Shannon. And it was so people went by ship. Well, when a ship went down, holy mackerel, there were a whole bunch of people who didn't have any way to get back from Europe to the United States. Wow. Because the ships were full, so they kind of squeezed some extra people in on our trip back to in September because of that. And we had a Texas oil millionaire on the ship, all these college kids, and he loved to play poker, and so the band would play, and he would play poker with all the students on the ship, and he lost in those days, some incredible amount of money. I don't know, $20,000, which to him was nothing, but was great. A lot of kids got their tuition paid, and when he got off the ship, he said, "Great music. It's the best trip I ever had, most fun I ever had."
Terrific.
So.
I want to go back to Hamilton for a moment. A lot of colleges these days have big problems with alcohol on campus. What was it like during your years here?
I think we had big problems.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that hasn't. I'm not sure it's gotten. I'm sure it hasn't gotten better, but I'm not sure it's gotten worse. I think there's always been a tremendous amount of drinking on college campuses. Certainly, where I live, the University of Vermont, this is a problem, and I think it's a problem every place. And I think we had our problems.
Okay, so it wasn't so much connected to the drinking age per se, which is higher now, but didn't change the issue.
I don't think so.
Okay.
That's not a very scientific answer, but I don't think so. I think we had a lot of drinking in those days.
All right. Tell me a little bit about playing with Emerson, and what was he like back then?
Emerson, I always thought, was an excellent leader. He was a very dogmatic guy who, my way or the highway kind of a guy, very much in control, which I think is good in a leader. It certainly as a young guy who'd never done this kind of stuff before, it was very helpful to be told what to do and how to do it and all of that. Emerson was also very nice to me. He helped me with some of my studies, and I always was, when you're sort of new and unknown, and somebody helps you get over the rough spots, you always remember those people. And I always, Emerson could be a very difficult person to work with. He was not always the friendliest person in the world, and he could be downright mean at times. And yet, because he had helped me out so much as a freshman, I always thought of that. And then, sometimes when he was a jerk, he really isn't. He's a good guy. He's just doing that. So, so I thought he was a great leader, and I think a lot of the success of the band was due to his musical leadership, to Donnie's wonderful ability to do all the behind-the-scenes stuff, and to these just killer drummers who just drove us at these tempos that would just knock your socks off. So I think those three things had a lot to do with it.
Well, you must have progressed pretty quickly as a trombone player, I guess, keeping up with that company.
Well, you know, it would be, there weren't a lot of recordings made. We actually have a recording from Carnegie Hall, but other than that, there isn't much. I wished I did, because it would be fun to get me. I've asked, since I've retired in the last 3 years, I've actually taken up the trombone after playing it for 50 years. And I actually study with a guy at the University of Vermont, Peter Bouchard, who's a classical trombonist. And I've certainly learned a great deal about playing the trombone. And I think I'm a much better trombonist now. But you know, you sure got good chops when you're 18, and you sure don't when you're 69. So I don't know. I've had some discussions with some trumpet players about this, about whether, you know, and some people feel that you know, that hearing my dad play, you know, a couple hours a day, every day of my life, probably until I went to college, probably was the best thing that could have happened to me.
Yeah.
And so with our own grandchildren, we always have jazz on the have a CD going. And you know what they like? And we have a pretty wide collection. You know what they like the most?
What is it?
Ellington, which is fascinating. Because
Wow.
I listen to a lot of hard bop. I listen to a lot of Dixieland, a lot of swing. A lot of 30s and 40s stuff now, and I'm even getting back into New Orleans stuff. There's all that stuff on. And I love the big band, you know, Woody Herman and Stan Kenton, but they actually like Ellington, which I think is good.
Uh-huh. And you still play LPs?
Oh, no.
You're all CD, you're all CD,
all
you're a CD guy now.
All CD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The AllStars nowadays, you guys get together once a year, or maybe is there other times that you're able to get together?
Well, we had been getting together a little more. You know, we had been getting together in the spring down in Washington, because the trumpet player and the banjo player, of course, are
Right.
down there, and we have a son who lives in Washington, so we like to go down there, and everybody likes to go to Washington. So we had been getting together in the spring. And in fact, last year we got together and practiced, and then actually had a gig, which was had a couple of gigs.
Mm-hmm.
But this year we didn't have any gigs, so it's getting harder to travel. So this will be a one-timer. Having said that, I think everybody in the band is playing a lot now. So we're not playing with these players, but we're playing with other bands.
Good.
So that makes it. So it comes together pretty quick.
So nobody shows up here and like plays a note and then goes, "Oh, gee, my chops are like."
No, not at all.
That's
good.
good.
Everybody's playing a lot.
That's good.
You know.
That's really. When you improvise on a particular song, are there things that are going through your head as far as note choices relating to chords, or is it more of a hearing?
It's almost exclusively hearing, because I'm not trained in chords. And actually, the guy I'm studying trombone now, who is a fine classical, he's tried to teach me the chord thing, and I can't do it. And it's because it's so much easier to do it the other way. And I guess at age 69, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to learn a hard way to do something that
you're already doing.
You know,
yeah.
So that, but the thing that I do notice about my improvising is that as I'm now playing a lot more, you begin to, there are just certain licks that you put into your brain that come out, and that didn't happen before. And I sort of agree with the people that say that I still think that's improvising, because you play it a little differently every time.
Oh,
certainly. And if you certainly listen to Teagarden, I mean, if you listen to his breaks on Royal Garden Blues, you know, half of the time they're the same ones. But why not?
Yeah.
They're spectacular.
That's style.
He plays them a little differently.
Yeah.
And it's not like a symphonic trombonist who would play this measure and it would sound exactly the same every time. No, it's
Right.
So I do notice that change now, which is, I think, good, not bad.
Well, don't let your teacher spoil you by making you do something that seems unnatural. You know, some of the greatest players, Zoot Sims and those fellows, are not so it's called schooled in that but the ears are
You
all
got
important.
you got to listen all the time.
Yeah.
I when young players ask me, what should I do? Just listen to good people all the time, and it doesn't particularly matter. I listen even to some symphonic stuff, but just listen to good music all the time,
Right.
and it's certainly easy advice to follow.
Yeah. Well, you sound like as a young man you were had a career goal in mind, and you achieved that, and you had a long career in the medical field.
Yes, and medicine is obviously demanding. I was the department chair of OB/GYN at the University of Vermont, so that was demanding, and so I really kind of fit in music very much around the edges.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when I'd come up here to play at reunions, it was very much like you say, I'd play a couple of tunes and say, man, my chops are dying, but people put up with me, which was good of them. But when I got ready to retire, I had always hoped that I could really get quite serious about the music, and so that's when I started the music lessons and actually playing in church brass groups and concert bands and just Vermont bands in the park for the summer. I just helped my reading and just as a chance to play and hear other musicians, and that's been fun. So
Right.
I've been able to be very serious about it for the last 3 years.
Did Hamilton have a concert series while you were here that brought jazz musicians to campus?
They did, and that was it was interesting. We had more bop musicians than Dixieland players at that time. In fact, probably the best concert I ever heard was J.J. Johnson, Tommy Flanagan, Tootie Heath, who was about 15 years old, and the cornet player was Nat Adderley.
Oh my!
And it was, and I remember it was over in Commons, what we call Commons.
Yeah.
And they got up on the stage, and JJ said, my schedule's been messed up, and I can only play for an hour. I'm going to play for an hour straight. And it was one of the best hours of jazz I ever heard, because that was a great supporting cast.
Yeah.
And then he had found a whole bunch of old guys, and I should know their names, but I don't, who came up with him. And he said, and they're gonna do the second half of the concert. Well, these are guys who didn't get to play a lot, I guess. They were wonderful musicians, and because they had the best time. So that thing went on for about 4 hours, and that was a great afternoon. Yeah.
I'll bet. And I love Nat Adderley.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And he was. I mean, these guys were very young. This would have been 50, the spring of '58.
Yeah.
And so these, it was just the height of that season, and it was.
Yeah.
I can't remember who the bass player was on that job, but Tommy Flanagan was always great.
What's the connection between the Catatonic Five and the Fallacious Five? Was that a little bit before?
That was before.
Okay.
And I think Emerson and Donnie perhaps were that was, Paul Parker was here when I was a student. He was a professor, but he played some, but not a great deal.
Right.
That was a little before, and that's you stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, that's what got it all started.
Yeah.
And then we just came at the right time.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting? At least I feel in those times when you're 18 and someone's 21 back in those times, and they have more experience, they just seem so much older and wiser and everything to you. And then you get older, 3 years is almost nothing,
It's a lifetime, and particularly you're coming from high school to college, and then an upperclassman. Wow, that's
right. Well, we have a lot in common. We have the music. We have children who went to Hamilton, and I'm really pleased to have been able to gather your thoughts about this whole thing. Is there anything that you'd like to add to what we've talked about?
No, I think we've covered it. It was a remarkable time in my life.
Yeah.
I think back to those days with just the greatest happiness, and I'm loving playing with the Alumni AllStars now. So music is just a happy thread, and I just hope I can keep playing till I'm 95 like my dad did.
Oh, that's a great thought. And as a sort of outside observer, but someone who's had the pleasure of sitting in a few times, I can say that in the last number of years, I've noticed a real jump in the band's, the whole sound you're putting out. It's been great to hear.
Well, come and hear us tonight.
I will.
Or tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night. All right. Well, thanks for your time.
Thank you,
It's been a
sir.
real pleasure.